The moon hung low in the sky, a bloated, sickly orb that cast an eerie silver glow over the churning sea. In the distance, a shadowy mass of land emerged from the mist, a jagged silhouette that resembled a set of decayed teeth, gnawing at the sky. This was Malheur Isle, better known to the locals as the Island of the Condemned. For centuries, it had been a place of exile, a remote prison where the worst criminals were sent to rot. No one ever returned. Those who tried washed up on the shores of the mainland, bloated and blue, their eyes eaten by fish. The island itself was said to be cursed, an inhospitable wasteland filled with twisted trees, poisonous plants, and a thick, oppressive fog that swallowed screams and laughter alike. The government had long since stopped sending people there, but the legend of the condemned lived on, whispered in dark alleys and drunken taverns. Some said the souls of the prisoners never left, that their hatred and suffering had seeped into the very soil. Others swore that something far older and far darker dwelled beneath the island's surface, feeding off the despair of those trapped there. And now, a small boat crept toward its shore. Jason Maddox stared ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the side of the boat. The motor sputtered, the sound barely audible over the relentless crash of waves. He felt the chill of the sea spray on his face, but his mind was elsewhere on the island, on the stories he'd heard as a child. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. Why had he agreed to this? Why had he let them convince him this was just a dare? Behind him, Amy, his girlfriend, sat clutching a flashlight, her face pale and drawn. She was the adventurous one, always dragging him into these wild schemes. But even she wasn't smiling now. There was a tension in the air, thick as smoke. "Do you think anyone's still alive over there?" Amy's voice trembled slightly. Jason didn't answer. He couldn't, because as much as he wanted to believe it was all just superstition, something in his gut told him they were walking into something far worse than abandoned cells and broken chains. The boat scraped against the rocky shore, the sound like a knife being dragged over bone. "We're here," muttered Ben, their mutual friend and the one who had come up with this insane plan in the first place. His eyes gleamed with a mixture of excitement and fear as he leaped out of the boat, pulling a rusted anchor onto the rocks. The three of them stood there, staring at the shadowy tree-line just beyond the beach. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and decay. Something reeked from the depths of the forest, a mix of rotting meat and damp earth. "Let's just get this over with," Amy whispered, flicking on the flashlight. The beam cut through the mist, revealing a narrow path leading into the thick foliage. The trees, their bark blackened and split, twisted in unnatural angles, as though they had grown in agony. Each branch was like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky, desperate to escape the ground that birthed it. They followed the path in silence, every step accompanied by the soft squelch of mud beneath their boots. Jason's pulse quickened as he noticed something strange in the ground. There were footprints, deep impressions in the earth, but they didn't look right. The spacing was wrong, as if whoever had made them was dragging something heavy behind them. "Guys, wait," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. But Amy and Ben were already ahead, the light from the flashlight dancing wildly as they navigated deeper into the woods. The fog closed in around them, the air thick and suffocating. Every breath Jason took felt like inhaling water. He glanced behind him, suddenly aware of how far they'd come from the boat. The sea was no longer visible, swallowed by the mist. He felt a cold dread curl around his spine, tightening with every passing second. And then they saw it. The prison. It stood there, a hulking mass of stone, its walls crumbling like the bones of a giant beast long dead. The iron bars of the windows were rusted, but some still held firm, twisted into grotesque shapes by time and neglect. Vines as thick as a man's arm snaked up the walls, but they too were blackened, as though burned from the inside. But it wasn't the building that made Jason's blood run cold. It was the figures. They stood just beyond the tree-line, barely visible in the swirling mist. Human shapes, or at least they used to be. Their skin hung loosely from their bones, sagging in patches where it hadn't already rotted away. Empty eye sockets stared back at them, hollow and lifeless, yet somehow filled with hate. The smell hit them all at once, a stench so overpowering that Jason gagged. It was the smell of death, of decay, of something long past saving. And then, without warning, the figures began to move, slowly at first, dragging their twisted limbs through the mud, their mouths opening in silent screams. "What the hell?" Amy whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of Jason's heart. Suddenly, one of the figures broke into a run in a lurching, jerky sprint toward them, its hands outstretched. Its skin split with every step, sloughing off in chunks as it moved, revealing muscle and bone beneath. "Run!" Ben screamed, shoving Jason forward. They bolted down the path, the sound of rotting feet splashing through the mud behind them. Jason's legs pumped harder than they ever had before, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the air grew colder, sharper, biting at his throat. Amy was right beside him, her flashlight bouncing wildly, casting distorted shadows across the trees. The figures behind them were gaining, their twisted limbs propelling them with unnatural speed despite the condition of their decayed bodies. The sound of the wet, slapping thud of flesh against the mud echoed in Jason's ears like a death march. "What the hell are they?" Amy screamed, not bothering to look back. "I don't know, just keep running." Jason's voice was hoarse, his throat raw with panic. Ben was ahead, leading the way, his breath a visible mist in the cold night air. They could barely see beyond the fog, the path narrowing as it twisted deeper into the island. Trees loomed overhead, their branches now fully entwined, creating a suffocating canopy. The smell of decay followed them like a living thing, wrapping itself around their lungs. They turned a sharp corner, and Jason's heart sank. The path ended abruptly at a sheer cliff. Below, the sea roared, crashing against jagged rocks. The mist hung thick, obscuring any sign of safety. They were trapped. "Oh, God!" Amy's voice wavered as she stumbled to a stop, her flashlight shaking uncontrollably. She swung it around, the beam cutting through the fog just enough to reveal the approaching horde. Dozens of them now, their decayed faces twisted in grimaces of silent torment, eyes hollow and dead, yet somehow burning with an ancient hunger. Ben turned around, his face pale, drenched in sweat. "There's got to be another way." A shriek cut through the air. One of the figures had closed the distance faster than the others. Its jaw hung slack, dislocated, its teeth shattered but jagged, the remnants of its tongue writhing like a snake. Ben didn't even have time to react. The creature lunged at him, its bony fingers digging into his shoulders as it knocked him to the ground. "Ben!" Jason shouted, but it was too late. The creature ripped into him, its fingers tearing through flesh with a sickening squelch, its face buried in Ben's neck. Blood sprayed across the rocks, a deep, dark red that glistened in the moonlight, pooling around Ben as he struggled beneath the creature's weight. His screams were short-lived, choked off by the gurgling sound of his throat being torn open. Jason grabbed Amy's arm, pulling her back as more figures closed in, their movements quickening as they tasted the blood in the air. He glanced at the cliff edge. It was their only option. "Amy, we have to jump. Are you insane?" Her eyes were wide, wild with fear, but Jason could feel the tremor in her body. The primal instinct to survive was taking over. "We'll die if we stay here." Jason pulled her closer to the edge. The wind whipped around them, the salt spray stinging their skin. He peered over the side. The water was a churning mass of white foam and jagged rocks, but it was better than being torn apart by those things. A crack sounded behind them. Jason turned in time to see another figure, a particularly large, hulking mass of flesh and rot barreling toward them. Its head was misshapen, a gaping hole where its face should have been, skin hanging in thick chunks from its chest. It moved with a terrifying speed, its movements jerky yet deliberate. "We have no choice," Jason yelled, his voice lost in the wind. He tightened his grip on Amy's arm and made the split-second decision. He launched himself off the cliff, dragging her with him. For a moment, there was nothing but the sensation of falling the ground disappearing beneath them, the roar of the sea growing louder, the wind howling in their ears. Time seemed to stretch, and Jason's heart pounded in his chest as the cold air rushed past them. Then they hit the water. The impact knocked the breath out of him. Jason felt his body plunge into the freezing depths, the shock of the cold water like 1,000 needles stabbing into his skin. His limbs flailed, struggling to find the surface. His lungs screamed for air as he kicked frantically, the weight of his soaked clothes pulling him down. For a terrifying second, he thought he might not make it. But then his head broke the surface, and he gasped for air, coughing as salt water filled his mouth. He glanced around wildly, searching for Amy. "Amy!" he shouted, his voice barely carrying over the waves. A moment later, she surfaced, her hair plastered to her face, eyes wide with shock. She gasped, spitting out water, but there was no time for relief. The waves were pulling them toward the rocks, their jagged edges slicing through the water like knives. "Swim!" Jason yelled, though his own muscles felt like lead. Every stroke was a battle against the current, the freezing water sapping his strength. He could see the shore ahead, a narrow strip of land nestled between the rocks, but the distance seemed impossible. And then he saw them, dark shapes moving beneath the surface. Something was in the water with them. Jason's heart lurched in his chest as a figure brushed against his leg, cold and slimy, its touch like death itself. He kicked harder, his pulse pounding in his ears. Another shape passed beneath him, its pale form barely visible in the murky depths. "Something's down here," Amy screamed, thrashing in the water. Her voice was high-pitched, panicked, the realization setting in. Jason didn't need to be told twice. He could feel it too, something circling them, something far worse than the rotting figures on the island. The surrounding sea seemed to darken, as if the water itself was becoming a living thing, a black mass of writhing shapes beneath the surface. A hand skeletal, long fingers coated in seaweed and grime, shot out from the water and wrapped around Jason's ankle, pulling him under. Jason felt a surge of cold panic as the skeletal hand tightened around his ankle, dragging him beneath the surface. The salt water stung his eyes, and the world above became a distorted blur of crashing waves and distant light. His lungs burned, desperate for air as he kicked frantically, trying to free himself from the grip of death. But the hand was relentless, pulling him deeper into the dark, icy depths. He could feel the weight of the water pressing down on him, the murky abyss swallowing him whole. His vision began to blur, and a ringing filled his ears. This was it. This was how it would end, lost in the cold embrace of the sea, surrounded by whatever horrors lurked beneath the surface. But then, something inside him snapped, a primal survival instinct that had kept him alive this long. With one last burst of energy, he kicked at the hand with all his strength. His boot connected with something solid, and for a moment the grip loosened. Desperately, he clawed toward the surface, his fingers reaching for the air that seemed so impossibly far away. Just as his chest was about to collapse from the strain, Jason's head broke through the water, and he gasped, sucking in deep, ragged breaths of cold night air. He sputtered and coughed, spitting out the salty taste of seawater, his vision clearing just enough to see the shoreline still too far, but closer than before. "Amy!" he shouted, his voice hoarse, filled with desperation. He scanned the water, his heart pounding wildly. There, just a few feet away, he saw her struggling, her arms flailing as she fought against the dark shapes circling beneath the waves. Jason's legs felt like lead, every stroke taking everything he had left, but he pushed forward, his focus solely on reaching her. He had to. He couldn't let her drown. He couldn't let them take her. Just as he reached her, another skeletal hand shot up from the water, wrapping around her wrist. Amy screamed, thrashing as she was pulled under. "No!" Jason grabbed her free hand, yanking her upward with all his might. The cold, bony fingers clung to her wrist, their grip unyielding, but Jason pulled harder, his muscles burning with the effort. With one final, desperate tug, he freed her from the hand's grasp. Amy gasped as she broke through the surface, her face pale and terror-stricken. Together, they swam toward the shore, the weight of exhaustion dragging at their limbs. The dark shapes beneath the water circled closer, but they could see the beach now. Just a few more feet, a few more strokes. The waves slammed them against the rocks, sharp edges cutting into their skin, but they didn't stop. Crawling on hands and knees, they dragged themselves onto the shore, collapsing on the wet sand, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. For a long moment, they just lay there, gasping for air, their chests heaving. The sea roared behind them, but the island was silent. Too silent. Jason pushed himself up on shaky arms, glancing around. The shore was narrow, a strip of sand surrounded by towering cliffs. The prison loomed in the distance, its twisted silhouette barely visible through the fog. And though they had escaped the water, the eerie sense of dread remained. Amy sat up beside him, wiping the water from her face. What were those things? Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with shock. "I don't know," Jason said, his voice hollow. He didn't have the strength to explain what he had seen, what had grabbed him beneath the waves. "But they're not just on the island. They're in the water too." Amy shivered, pulling her knees to her chest. "We need to get off this island." Jason nodded, but deep down he knew it wasn't going to be that easy. The figures on the island, the creatures in the water, this place was alive with something ancient, something that thrived on the suffering and death of those trapped here. They weren't just dealing with ghosts or cursed prisoners. This island was a prison for something far older, far darker. They had disturbed it, and now it wanted them. "We need to find somewhere to hide," Jason said, his voice steadier now. "Somewhere we could figure out how to get out of here." Amy nodded, though her eyes were filled with fear. They both stood, their legs shaking beneath them as they looked toward the trees. The same twisted forest they had fled from now seemed like their only chance of survival. The sea wasn't safe. The island wasn't safe. Nothing was safe. As they stumbled forward, deeper into the island's cursed landscape, the wind began to howl. The fog thickened, and the trees swayed in the night, their branches creaking like bones. In the distance, a low, mournful sound echoed through the mist, a wail, long and agonized, as if the very island itself was crying out in pain. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. Whatever was waiting for them in the heart of this island, it wasn't done with them yet. And they weren't alone. The condemned were coming. They had only just begun to understand the true horror of Malheur Isle.